Chapter 1. An Unexpected Guest at Thornfield Hall. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn of Thornfield Hall as Mrs. Dolores Blackwood presided over what was widely considered the social event of the season in St. Mary Mead. Her annual garden party had, over the years, evolved from a simple tea-gathering into an elaborate affair that the villagers spoke about for weeks afterward. Today was no exception, with tables adorned in crisp white linen scattered strategically across the garden, each bearing silver trays of delicate sandwiches and Mrs. Blackwood's renowned Victoria sponge cake. "I do believe this is our best turnout," yet Mrs. Blackwood remarked to her husband, Colonel Arthur Blackwood, who stood beside her, his military posture unchanged despite his retirement some 15 years prior. "Even Miss Marple has graced us with her presence." The Colonel followed his wife's gaze to where Jane Marple sat beneath the shade of a magnificent oak tree, her nimble fingers working at her ever-present knitting as she engaged in polite conversation with Dr. Gerard, the village's newest resident physician. At 82, Miss Marple maintained the sharp blue eyes and alert demeanour that had always characterised her, though her once auburn hair had long since turned a snowy white. "Ah, yes," the Colonel replied with a slight nod. "Curious woman, always, watching that one." "She's harmless, Arthur," Mrs. Blackwood said dismissively, though she lowered her voice. "Though I must say there's something unnerving about the way she notices everything, like those birds that pick at every little crumb." Miss Marple, despite the distance, seemed to sense their attention, and offered a gentle smile in their direction before returning to her conversation with the doctor. Across the lawn, among the more boisterous guests, stood Philip Harrington, the newly appointed director of the Thornfield Trust, a charitable organisation established by the Blackwood family generations ago. At 38, his dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored summer suit. He laughed heartily at something said by Eliza Blackwood, the Colonel's niece, a beautiful young woman of 25, whose recent return from London had caused quite a stir in the village. "My dear Eliza," Philip said, his voice carrying just enough to reach nearby guests, "you simply must tell your uncle about your fascinating proposal for the trust. I think it's precisely the progressive thinking we need." Eliza smiled, though Miss Marple, observing from afar, noted that the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, Uncle Arthur has made it quite clear he's not interested in my ideas," she replied, the lightness in her tone belied by a certain tension in her shoulders. "Nonsense," Philip countered. "The trust needs fresh perspectives. And who better than a Blackwood to provide them?" Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles Pemberton, the village solicitor, a thin, nervous man whose perpetually furrowed brow gave him the appearance of being constantly worried. "Harrington," he said with a curt nod, before turning to Eliza. "Miss Blackwood, looking lovely as always." The charged atmosphere between the three did not escape Miss Marple's notice, nor did the way Vivian Harrington, Philip's wife, watched the exchange from several paces away, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around the stem of her champagne glass. "Trouble brewing there, wouldn't you say, Dr. Gerard?" Miss Marple asked softly, her knitting needles never pausing in their rhythmic movement. Dr. Gerard, a thoughtful man in his early 40s, followed her gaze. "I'm relatively new to the village, Miss Marple. I'm afraid I don't know all the histories yet." "Oh, there are always histories in small villages," she replied with a gentle smile. "People are the same everywhere, you know, just like my grandnephew Raymond's circle in London. All those complicated relationships and old grievances, only here they're magnified by proximity and time." Their conversation was suddenly interrupted by the unexpected arrival of a sleek, black automobile that pulled up the gravel driveway with a crunch that seemed to silence the party momentarily. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall, slender woman in a fashionable city outfit that instantly marked her as an outsider in the rural village. "Good heavens!" murmured Mrs. Entwistle, the vicar's wife, who had joined Miss Marple and Dr. Gerard moments before. "Is that Diana Harrington?" confirmed Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting for the first time that afternoon. "Philip's sister. How very interesting." The newcomer paused at the edge of the garden, surveying the scene with an expression that seemed to Miss Marple to be part amusement, part contempt. The resemblance to her brother was striking. The same dark eyes, the same proud bearing. But where Philip exuded charm, Diana radiated a cold determination. Colonel Blackwood was the first to recover from the surprise, stepping forward with the practised courtesy of a lifetime military man. "Miss Harrington," he said, extending his hand, "we weren't expecting you." Diana's smile was razor-thin. "Evidently not, Colonel. But when I heard about the gathering, I simply couldn't resist. It's been far too long since I've seen my dear brother." Holt's eyes turned to Philip, whose face had drained of colour. Vivian moved swiftly to his side, her smile fixed in place, though her eyes had hardened. "Diana," Philip managed, his usual confident tone notably absent. "What an unexpected surprise." "The best kind, wouldn't you agree?" Diana replied, stepping forward to place a kiss on her brother's cheek. "We have so much to catch up on." The silence that fell over the garden party was complete, broken only by the distant toll of the church bells marking the hour. 6 chimes, and, with the last one, a scream pierced the air, coming from the direction of the house. Miss Marple rose to her feet with remarkable agility for a woman her age, her knitting forgotten on the chair beside her. Her eyes, far from showing alarm, reflected a curious mixture of concern and calculation. The scream had come from Dolores Blackwood's personal maid, who now stood at the French doors leading from the house to the garden, her face ashen. "Mr. Harrington!" she gasped, pointing back toward the house. "In the study! There's been a terrible accident!" Chapter 2. Whispers in the Drawing Room. "Dead? Are you quite certain?" Vivian Harrington's voice cut through the stunned silence that had descended upon the drawing room of Thornfield Hall. The garden party guests had been hastily ushered inside by a visibly shaken Colonel Blackwood, while Dr. Gerard had immediately rushed to the study where Philip Harrington's body had been discovered sprawled across the antique Aubusson carpet. "I'm afraid there's no doubt, Mrs. Harrington," Dr. Gerard said gravely as he returned to the drawing-room. "Your husband appears to have suffered a severe blow to the head. Inspector Craddock has been notified and is on his way from Much Benham." A collective murmur rippled through the assembled guests. Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner armchair, her knitting resting untouched in her lap, as she observed the reactions around her with keen interest. Diana Harrington stood by the fireplace, her face a mask of composed shock. "How perfectly dreadful!" she said. though Miss Marple noted that her voice lacked the tremor one might expect from a woman who had just lost her brother. "And on the very day I arrived to see him, after all this time. A coincidence, surely," remarked Charles Pemberton, the solicitor, though his tone suggested otherwise. Eliza Blackwood, who had been unusually silent, suddenly spoke up. "Who found him?" Her voice was steady, but her fingers twisted the pearl necklace at her throat with nervous energy. "I did." Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward, her normally perfect composure visibly fractured. "I went to fetch the portfolio of trust documents that Philip had asked to review. He'd mentioned going to the study to make a telephone call during the, party? When he didn't return," she faltered. There, my dear," the Colonel said, awkwardly patting his wife's shoulder. "You mustn't distress yourself. When did anyone last see Mr. Harrington alive?" This practical question came from Miss Marple, her soft voice somehow carrying across the room despite its gentleness. All eyes turned to her, as if surprised to find the elderly woman in their midst. "I spoke with him perhaps 20 minutes before he was found," offered Vivian Harrington, who had sunk into a chair, her earlier sharp demeanour softened by what appeared to be genuine shock. "He mentioned receiving an urgent telephone call and excused himself." "Did he seem troubled by anything?" Miss Marple asked, her innocent blue eyes belying the shrewdness behind the question. Before Vivian could answer, the drawing-room door opened to admit Inspector Craddock, a tall, serious man in his 40s, whom Miss Marple had encountered on previous investigations. His eyes scanned the room before momentarily resting on Miss Marple with a flicker of recognition. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with professional detachment, "I understand you've suffered a terrible shock. I must ask that everyone remain at Thornfield Hall until I've had the opportunity to speak with each of you." "Surely you don't suspect foul play, Inspector?" Colonel Blackwood asked, his military bearing straightening as if preparing for confrontation. "Dr. Gerard has already indicated it was an accident. A fall, perhaps?" Dr. Gerard cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Actually, Colonel, I made no such pronouncement. The nature of the wound suggests, well, it seems unlikely to have been caused by a simple fall." A tense silence followed this revelation. Miss Marple noticed how Diana Harrington's gaze sharpened, focusing on Vivian with an expression that mingled calculation with something that might have been satisfaction. "Murder," Mrs. Entwistle whispered, the word seeming to hang in the air like a physical presence. "In St. Mary Mead, of all places." Now, Agnes, her husband the vicar, admonished gently, "We mustn't jump to conclusions." "Indeed," agreed Inspector Craddock. "However, I must treat this as a suspicious death until proven otherwise. Sergeant Davis will take preliminary statements from everyone while I examine the scene." As the inspector departed, the guests began to separate into small clusters, whispered theories circulating rapidly. Miss Marple watched as Charles Pemberton approached Eliza Blackwood, speaking in low, urgent tones that caused the young woman's face to pale further. "Miss Marple," Dr. Gerard said, taking a seat beside her, "I couldn't help noticing your question earlier. Do you have some insight into this terrible business?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh dear, no. Just an old woman's curiosity. But I did observe that Mr. Harrington seemed quite agitated after his conversation with Mr. Pemberton and Miss Blackwood. And then, of course, there was his sister's unexpected arrival. You think these events are connected to his death? In my experience, Doctor, coincidences in timing often prove significant. It reminds me of poor Mrs. Bartlett from the village, whose prize roses were mysteriously damaged the very same day her neighbour's nephew arrived for a visit. A nephew who had once proposed to Mrs. Bartlett's daughter and been rather firmly rejected. Before Dr. Gerard could puzzle out the relevance of this seemingly tangential anecdote, they were interrupted by a commotion at the door. Vivian Harrington had risen, her composure cracking. "I demand to see my husband," she said, her voice rising. "I have every right—" "I'm afraid that's impossible at present, Mrs. Harrington," Inspector Craddock said, having returned to the drawing-room. His expression was grave. "I've completed my initial examination, and I must inform you all that this case is now officially a murder investigation. Mr. Harrington was struck from behind with considerable force using a heavy object. The marble, paperweight found beside the body, to be precise." A collective gasp rippled through the room. "Furthermore," the inspector continued, "it appears that some papers are missing from the desk. Mrs. Blackwood, you mentioned a portfolio of documents." Mrs. Blackwood nodded stiffly. "The Thornfield Trust documents. Philip had been reviewing them this past week." "Well, they're not in the study now," Craddock stated, "which suggests our killer may have had a motive beyond personal animosity toward Mr. Harrington." Miss Marple's needles had begun to move again, the clicking a gentle counterpoint to the tense atmosphere. Her eyes, however, missed nothing. Not Diana's slight smile, quickly suppressed, nor the look that passed between Charles Pemberton and Eliza Blackwood, nor the way Colonel Blackwood's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his handkerchief. "Believe," Inspector Craddock announced, "that we have a great deal to discuss." Chapter 3. Afternoon Tea and Pointed Questions. The morning after Philip Harrington's murder dawned with an unsettling quietude over St. Mary Mead. The news had spread through the village like wildfire, travelling from the butcher to the baker, from the post office to the vicarage, embellished with each retelling until Philip Harrington had been transformed from a respected trust director into a man of mysterious and possibly dubious character. Miss Marple sat in her garden, pruning her roses with meticulous care, when the gate creaked open to admit Inspector Craddock. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Inspector," she replied, setting aside her gardening shears. "I've been expecting you. Martha has just prepared some tea, if you'd care to join." "Me?" The inspector smiled faintly. He had worked with Miss Marple on enough previous cases to appreciate her uncanny insights, though he would never admit as much to his superiors at Scotland Yard. "I won't pretend this is merely a social call," he said, once they were settled with tea and a plate of freshly baked scones. "Your powers of observation often notice what others miss." Miss Marple blushed modestly. "Oh, I wouldn't say that. It's just that people are remarkably similar wherever one goes. Human nature doesn't change, you know." "And what has human nature revealed to you about yesterday's events?" She poured more tea before answering. "It was most peculiar that Diana Harrington should arrive precisely when she did, don't you think? Particularly as I gather from Mrs. Blackwood that the Harrington siblings had been estranged for some years." Craddock nodded. 5 years, to be precise." According to Mrs. Harrington, Vivian that is, the siblings quarrelled over their father's estate. Diana felt she'd been unfairly treated in the will. "I see," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "And the missing trust documents, have they been recovered?" "No, though we're still searching." Colonel Blackwood was quite agitated about their disappearance. Apparently, they contained sensitive information about the trust's finances and beneficiaries. "How interesting. You know, it reminds me of the Wilson family in the village. Old Mr. Wilson altered his will repeatedly, playing his children against each other. When he died, the final will mysteriously vanished, and the earlier one, which favoured the eldest son, was the only one found." Craddock smiled indulgently. "And I suppose the eldest son had something to do with the disappearance?" "Oh, no, Inspector. It was the housekeeper. She had hopes that the eldest son would marry her daughter, you see." The inspector had long since learned not to dismiss Miss Marple's seemingly rambling anecdotes. "You're suggesting that Mrs. Blackwood might have taken the documents. She was the one who found the body." "I'm not suggesting anything, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly. "Merely noting patterns. Have you had the opportunity to speak with Charles Pemberton? As the Trust's solicitor, he would be familiar with those documents." "I interviewed him this morning," Craddock confirmed. "He seemed nervous, though that could simply be his nature. He claimed to have been discussing the garden with Mrs. Entwistle when Harrington was killed, and she corroborated his statement. Ah, yes, Mrs. Entwistle is an avid gardener," Miss Marple murmured, "though she's rather short-sighted without her spectacles, which I noticed she wasn't wearing yesterday." Craddock raised an eyebrow, but made no comment, instead taking a small notebook from his pocket. "I've been compiling a timeline. Harrington excused himself from the party shortly after his sister arrived, saying he needed to make a telephone call. Mrs. Blackwood found him approximately 20 minutes later. During that time, several guests were unaccounted for at various points." "Including Eliza Blackwood, I presume?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes. She claims she went to fetch a shawl from her room, as the afternoon had grown chilly. No one can confirm this." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles resuming their rhythmic clicking. "Young Miss Blackwood seemed rather tense during the party, particularly when Mr. Harrington mentioned her proposal for the trust." "Yes, we've heard about that. Apparently, she wanted to redirect some of the Trust's assets toward educational programs for underprivileged children in London. The Colonel was firmly opposed, considering it outside the Trust's traditional scope." "And where does Colonel Blackwood stand now that Mr. Harrington is gone?" Craddock's expression sharpened. "That's an interesting question. As chairman of the trustees, the Colonel will have significant influence over who replaces Harrington as director. I imagine Mr. Pemberton, as the Trust's solicitor, would also have something to say about that," Miss Marple commented. "And of course, there's Mrs. Harrington to consider." "Vivian Harrington?" Craddock looked surprised. "She has no official connection to the Trust." "Perhaps not officially," Miss Marple agreed. "But I understand she was quite involved in her husband's work. Mrs. Blackwood mentioned at the garden party that Vivian had been instrumental in modernising the Trust's investment strategy." The inspector made a note. "I'll look into that. What's your impression of her, Miss Marple?" "A very capable woman," she replied carefully, "though perhaps not entirely satisfied with living in her husband's shadow. It reminded me of Mrs. Jenkins, from the village, who managed all her husband's affairs while allowing him to believe he was in charge. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Gerard, who looked surprised to find the inspector there. "I do apologize for intruding," he said, hesitating at the garden gate. "Not at all, Doctor," Miss Marple called. "Please join us. Martha can bring another cup." Once Dr. Gerard was settled, Craddock asked, "Have you completed the post-mortem report?" "Doctor?" "Yes, that's why I stopped by," Gerard replied, accepting tea from Miss Marple. "I thought Miss Marple might be interested, given her expertise in these matters." "Most kind of you," she said with a smile. The cause of death was indeed blunt force trauma, Gerard confirmed. A single powerful blow to the back of the head with the marble paperweight. Death would have been almost instantaneous. "Any signs of a struggle?" Craddock asked. "None. He was struck from behind, probably without warning." The doctor hesitated. There was something else, though. Preliminary toxicology indicates he had consumed a significant amount of digitalis. "Poison!" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "Not enough to be fatal, but certainly enough to cause disorientation, perhaps even hallucinations. It was likely administered in his tea or champagne at the party." Craddock frowned. So someone wanted to incapacitate him before killing him, or ensure he would die, even if the blow didn't kill him, Dr. Gerard suggested. "Either way, it points to premeditation." Miss Marple set down her teacup with a thoughtful expression. "How very strange. It seems our killer was determined that Mr. Harrington should die yesterday. I wonder—" "Yes?" Craddock prompted when she didn't continue. "Oh, nothing concrete," she said with a small smile. "Just an old woman's fancies. But I think perhaps I should pay a call on Diana Harrington this afternoon. It seems a neighbourly thing to do, given the circumstances." After the men had departed, Miss Marple remained in her garden, her thoughts turning over the various pieces of information like puzzle pieces. The digitalis suggested careful planning. The missing documents pointed to a motive beyond personal animosity. And Diana Harrington's timely arrival, well, that was curious indeed. As she returned to her roses, Miss Marple reflected that murders like gardens required patience and careful observation. The truth would emerge in its own time, if one knew precisely where to look. Chapter 4. The Obvious Suspect. The Blackwood Arms, St. Mary Mead's only public house, buzzed with uncharacteristic activity that evening. Murder was, after all, a rare occurrence in the sleepy village, and everyone had a theory to share. "It was the sister, mark my words," declared Mr. Fitzsimmons, the retired banker, with the confidence of one who has solved the mystery before the authorities. "Arrives out of nowhere after 5 years, and her brother drops dead the same day. Too neat by half." "I heard they quarrelled over the inheritance," Mrs. Pierce from the bakery added. "Left her with practically nothing, he did." In the corner booth, Inspector Craddock sat with Sergeant Davis, nursing a half-pint and listening to the village gossip with professional interest. Public opinion often contained kernels of truth, though buried beneath layers of speculation and embellishment. "The village has made up its mind," Davis observed quietly. "So it would seem," Craddock replied. "And they may not be entirely wrong. Diana Harrington had motive, opportunity, and no credible alibi for the 20 minutes her brother was alone in the study. She claims she was in the garden, admiring the roses. Yes, conveniently alone. Craddock drummed his fingers on the table. And then there's the matter of the digitalis. Dr. Gerard says it was likely administered at the party, before Harrington went inside. Diana arrived, greeted her brother, and then he began to feel unwell enough to make a telephone call. Or so he claimed. You think she poisoned him at the greeting? It's possible. A poisoned ring, perhaps, or something on her gloves when she touched his face. We're having her belongings examined. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles Pemberton, who hesitated visibly upon seeing the police officers, before approaching their table. "May I join you, gentlemen?" he asked, his perpetually worried expression more pronounced than usual. "By all means," Craddock replied, gesturing to the empty chair. "A trying time for all involved, I imagine." Pemberton nodded, signalling to the barman for a drink before speaking. "That's precisely why I wanted a word, Inspector, about Diana Harrington." Craddock's interest sharpened. "Go on." "I feel I should make you aware of certain circumstances regarding the Harrington estate. As the family solicitor, I handled old Mr. Harrington's will, Philip and Diana's father." "The will that caused the estrangement?" Pemberton looked surprised. "You're well informed. Yes, though the situation was more complex than simple jealousy. You see, Conrad Harrington left controlling interest in the family business to Philip, with only a modest trust fund for Diana. She contested the will, claiming her father had been unduly influenced during his final illness by Philip and his wife." Pemberton lowered his voice. "Vivian Harrington is a formidable woman, Inspector, far more ambitious than her husband ever was." Across the village, Miss Marple was engaged in what appeared to be a social call at Sycamore Cottage, where Diana Harrington had taken rooms following her brother's death. "It's most kind of you to visit, Miss Marple," Diana said, pouring tea with practised elegance. "Though I confess I'm surprised. We hadn't been introduced before today. St. Mary Mead is a small village, Miss Harrington. We take care of our own, and our visitors, in times of distress." Miss Marple accepted the tea with a smile. "And I did so want to offer my condolences. Such a dreadful business." Diana's expression remained composed. "Yes, quite dreadful. Though Philip and I had our differences, he was still my brother." "It must have been difficult, being estranged for so long." Something flickered in Diana's eyes. A brief, unguarded emotion quickly suppressed. "Water under the bridge now, I suppose, though I had hoped we might reconcile. That's why I came, you know." "Indeed." Miss Marple looked interested. "It wasn't a spontaneous visit, then?" "Not entirely. I wrote to Philip last month, suggesting we put our differences aside. He agreed to meet, though he preferred I not tell Vivian in advance. Their marriage was complicated." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet you arrived during a garden party, when discretion would have been difficult." Diana's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "A miscommunication. I thought the party was the following day, but since I'd driven all the way from London—" "Of course," Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "May I ask, what do you plan to do now? Will you return to London?" "Not immediately. There are matters to settle with Philip's estate, naturally. And then there's the trust." "The Thornfield Trust? Were you involved with it?" "Not as such." Diana set down her teacup with deliberate precision. "Though I'd recently developed an interest. In fact, Philip and I were meant to discuss certain irregularities I'd noticed in its management. Miss Marple's expression remained mild, though her eyes sharpened with interest. Irregularities? How concerning! I understand some important documents went missing after your brother's death. For the first time, Diana looked genuinely startled. Missing? What documents? The trust portfolio. Inspector Craddock mentioned it was taken from the study where poor Mr. Harrington was found. Diana's brow furrowed. I wasn't aware of that. How very convenient for someone. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed softly. Most convenient. Later that evening, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she was startled by an unexpected knock at her cottage door. Opening it cautiously, she found Eliza Blackwood standing on her doorstep, her face pale in the moonlight. Miss Blackwood! This is a surprise. I'm sorry to disturb you so late, Miss Marple, but I desperately need your advice. The young woman's voice trembled slightly. May I come in? Once settled by the fire with a fortifying glass of elderberry wine, Eliza spoke in a hurried, anxious tones. I think Inspector Craddock suspects me of killing Philip. He's been asking questions about my proposal for the trust, implying I had a motive. And did you, my dear? Miss Marple asked gently. Eliza looked startled. Of course not. Philip was supportive of my ideas, even if Uncle Arthur wasn't. I see. Then perhaps there's another reason the inspector might be interested in your movements yesterday. Eliza's fingers twisted nervously in her lap. I wasn't entirely truthful about where I went during the party. I didn't go to fetch a shawl. No. Eliza took a deep breath. I went to meet Charles, Mr. Pemberton, behind the greenhouse. We've been seeing each other, secretly. Uncle Arthur wouldn't approve. He thinks Charles isn't good enough for a Blackwood. And were you with Mr. Pemberton the entire time? Yes, until we heard the scream. But we can't tell the inspector that without revealing our relationship, and Charles is worried it would prejudice Uncle Arthur against him. There's going to be a vacancy on the trust board now, you see, and Charles has always hoped. Miss Marple nodded understandingly. Secrets have a way of becoming burdens, especially during a murder investigation. But tell me, Miss Blackwood, did you happen to see anyone else while you were near the greenhouse? Anyone going toward the house, perhaps? Eliza frowned in concentration. I don't think so. Wait. Yes, I did see someone. Vivian Harrington. She was walking up the garden path toward the study's French doors. She seemed in a hurry. How curious, Miss Marple said, her knitting needles pausing. And this was before the scream? Yes, perhaps 10 minutes before. I didn't think anything of it at the time. She was his wife, after all. But now indeed, Miss Marple agreed softly. Now indeed. Chapter 5. Roses and Thorns. The morning of the inquest dawned with a persistent drizzle that seemed to mirror the sombre mood of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, undeterred by the weather, set out early with her umbrella firmly in hand. Instead of heading directly to the village hall where the inquest was to be held, however, she made a slight detour toward Thornfield Hall. The grand house loomed grey against the misty landscape, its windows like watchful eyes. Miss Marple approached not via the main drive, but through the garden gate, a route that would arouse less curiosity. She had a particular interest in examining the area near the greenhouse, where Eliza Blackwood and Charles Pemberton had conducted their clandestine meeting. Miss Marple, what a surprise! She turned to find Dr. Gerard approaching along the garden path, his medical bag in hand. "Good morning, Doctor. I see we're both early birds," he smiled. "Mrs. Blackwood requested something for her nerves before the inquest. And you?" "Oh, just an old woman's curiosity," she replied lightly. "The roses here are quite spectacular, even in this dreary weather." Dr. Gerard glanced at the rose bushes lining the path. "Indeed they are, though I'm afraid I know little about gardening." "Such a pity. I find it most instructive, the careful cultivation, the pruning of unwanted growth, the constant vigilance against disease and parasites." Her eyes twinkled. "Not unlike your profession in some ways." "I suppose there are similarities," he agreed, "though I deal with more complicated organisms. Oh, I wouldn't underestimate the complexity of a garden, Doctor. Take these roses, for instance." She gestured to a particularly vibrant crimson bloom. "The Rosa gallica officinalis, the apothecary's rose. Did you know it was once valued for its medicinal properties?" "I did not," he admitted, looking more closely at the flower. "Oh, yes, quite potent in certain preparations, as are many common garden plants. Digitalis from foxgloves, for instance." Dr. Gerard's expression sharpened. "A curious example to choose, Miss Marple." "Is it? Perhaps it's on my mind after your revelation about poor Mr. Harrington." She bent to examine the rose more closely. "How interesting! Someone has been cutting blooms quite recently. See the fresh cuts." Before Dr. Gerard could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Blackwood, striding purposefully across the lawn. "Miss Marple, Dr. Gerard," he greeted them stiffly. "I wasn't aware we were expecting visitors this morning." "Forgive the intrusion, Colonel," Miss Marple said with an apologetic smile. "I was simply admiring your roses on my way to the inquest. They're quite remarkable." "My wife's domain, I'm afraid," he replied. "I know little about them, except that they require constant attention and expense." "The best things often do," she agreed. "I noticed some fresh cuttings. Did Mrs. Blackwood prepare an arrangement for the house?" The Colonel frowned. "Not that I'm aware of. Perhaps one of the gardeners." "Of course. Well, I mustn't delay you further. The inquest will be starting soon." As they made their way toward the village, Miss Marple fell into step beside Dr. Gerard, who seemed lost in thought. "A penny for them, Doctor." He hesitated before responding. "I was just thinking about what you said regarding the roses, the apothecary's rose and its medicinal properties." "Oh, did I say something amiss?" "Not amiss exactly, but it made me wonder. Someone with knowledge of plants might easily obtain digitalis without arousing suspicion." "How very true," Miss Marple nodded. "And so much more convenient than purchasing it from a chemist, where it would be recorded." The village hall was already filling with curious onlookers when they arrived. Miss Marple took a seat near the back, her observant gaze moving from face to face. Diana Harrington sat rigidly beside her solicitor, her elegant black attire marking her as both bereaved and, in the eyes of many, suspect. Vivian Harrington sat apart, her pale features composed behind a discreet veil. The proceedings began with the coroner's preliminary remarks, followed by Dr. Gerard's testimony regarding the cause of death. His description of the digitalis poisoning created a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. "And in your professional opinion, Doctor?" the coroner asked, could such poisoning occur accidentally? It seems highly unlikely, Dr. Gerard replied. The concentration was significant, suggesting deliberate administration. Next came Inspector Craddock, who outlined the discovery of the body and the subsequent investigation. He mentioned the missing trust documents and the marble paperweight used as the murder weapon, which had been wiped clean of fingerprints. "We have reason to believe," Craddock stated carefully, "that the motive may be connected to a long-standing dispute over the Harrington family inheritance, recently complicated by matters related to the Thornfield Trust." All eyes turned briefly to Diana Harrington, whose expression remained impassive. As the inquest proceeded, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small detail that seemed to have escaped everyone else's notice. Eliza Blackwood, seated beside, her uncle wore a small brooch shaped like a rose. It was a delicate piece, crafted of gold with tiny rubies forming the petals. But what caught Miss Marple's interest was not its beauty, but its familiarity. She had seen it before, or rather, a photograph of it, in a silver frame on Philip Harrington's desk during a charity committee meeting at Thornfield Hall some months ago. The coroner called Mrs. Blackwood to testify next. She described finding Philip's body and confirmed that the missing documents pertained to the trust's finances. When questioned about her relationship with the deceased, she was circumspect. "Mr. Harrington was an excellent director," she stated. "His financial acumen was precisely what the trust needed during these difficult economic times." "And were you aware of any tensions between Mr. Harrington and other parties present at your garden party?" the coroner pressed. Mrs. Blackwood hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly toward Diana. "I knew of the estrangement between Philip and his sister, of course, and there had been some professional disagreements regarding the trust's future direction. Following the inquest, which concluded with a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Charles Pemberton, who seemed eager to share his thoughts. "They're focusing on Diana," he said in a low voice, "but I'm not convinced." "Oh, you have doubts, Mr. Pemberton?" He glanced around before continuing. "Philip came to see me the morning before the garden party. He was concerned about discrepancies he'd found in the trust's accounts, significant sums diverted over the past year." "How troubling," Miss Marple murmured. "Did he suspect someone specifically?" "He didn't say, but he was determined to resolve it before the quarterly board meeting next week." Pemberton adjusted his spectacles nervously. He planned to present his findings to the Colonel that very evening. After the party? Yes. He'd prepared a complete report, likely the documents that went missing. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "People will go to great lengths to protect their reputations, Mr. Pemberton. Even greater lengths to protect their fortunes." As they reached the village square, Miss Marple paused. "I couldn't help noticing Miss Blackwood's lovely brooch today. Quite striking." "Oh, the rose?" Pemberton smiled slightly. "A gift from her aunt, I believe." "How nice," Miss Marple replied, though her expression suggested she found this information more significant than she let on. "Family heirlooms often carry such interesting histories, don't they?" Chapter 6. Buried Histories. The day after the inquest, St. Mary Mead was abuzz with fresh speculation. The revelation of digitalis poisoning had added a new dimension to the murder, one that suggested careful planning rather than a heated moment of passion. For Miss Marple, this detail confirmed what she had suspected from the beginning, that Philip Harrington's death was neither impulsive nor simple. She was knitting by her window, contemplating the case, when she observed Vivian Harrington walking briskly toward the vicarage. The widow's determined stride suggested a purpose beyond a social call. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and reached for her hat. The vicarage garden adjoined her own property, and she had long ago discovered that deadheading her border flowers often yielded interesting insights into parish matters. Within minutes, she was methodically tending to her delphiniums, just within earshot of the vicarage's open study window. "It's absolutely intolerable, Vicar," Vivian's voice carried clearly on the still air. "The way people are looking at Diana, as if she's already been convicted. Murder inevitably stirs strong emotions, Mrs. Harrington," the vicar replied gently. "People seek simple explanations." "There's nothing simple about this situation," Vivian insisted. "Diana and Philip had reconciled through letters weeks ago. Their quarrel was ancient history." Miss Marple paused in her gardening. This contradicted what Diana had told her, that she had written to Philip only the previous month, suggesting reconciliation. "And what of the trust documents?" the vicar asked. "Inspector Craddock seems to think they may be central to the motive." "Philip was always meticulous about the trust," Vivian replied. "He'd discovered irregularities in the accounts, nothing too serious, but enough to raise questions about oversight. And who was responsible for that oversight?" There was a brief pause before Vivian answered. "The trustees collectively, though Colonel Blackwood, as chairman, held ultimate responsibility. Philip was preparing a report for the board meeting next week." "A report that's now missing," the vicar observed. "Yes, though I have my own copies of most of the relevant documents. Philip always kept duplicates in our London flat. I've informed Inspector Craddock. This revelation was interrupted by the arrival of a third person. Judging by the crisp footsteps and authoritative knock, Miss Marple deduced it was Inspector Craddock himself. Mrs. Harrington, Vicar, I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Inspector," the vicar replied. "Mrs. Harrington and I were just discussing the trust situation. As it happens, that's precisely why I've come," Craddock said. "Mrs. Harrington, I've reviewed the documents you provided. They've proven most illuminating, particularly regarding certain financial transactions authorized by Colonel Blackwood." "Thought they might," Vivian replied, her tone carefully neutral. Miss Marple, deciding her presence might soon be noticed, gathered her gardening tools and retreated to her cottage. She had much to consider, not least the apparent contradiction between Diana and Vivian's accounts of the siblings' reconciliation. Later that afternoon, she called on Mrs. Dolores Blackwood, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming church fete. Mrs. Blackwood received her in the drawing-room, the very space where the garden party guests had gathered after Philip's body was discovered. "I'm afraid I haven't given much thought to the fete arrangements, Miss Marple," Mrs. Blackwood apologized, pouring tea with a slightly trembling hand. "Recent events have been most distracting." "Perfectly understandable, my dear," Miss Marple assured her. "Such a dreadful business. And now I hear Inspector Craddock is looking into the trust finances." Mrs. Blackwood's cup clattered slightly against its saucer. "Yes, well, it's all rather tedious. Arthur assures me it's merely routine. I'm sure you're right, though I understand Mr. Harrington had prepared some sort of report? Philip was always preparing reports, Mrs. Blackwood said dismissively. He had a bureaucrat's love of paperwork. I suppose that's why he was so effective as director, Miss Marple observed. By the way, I couldn't help admiring your roses the other day. The apothecary's rose is particularly fine this year. Is it? I wouldn't know. The head gardener manages that side of things. Of course, though I believe I saw Eliza cutting some blooms recently. She has your eye for beauty. That lovely rose brooch she wore at the inquest, for instance. Something flickered in Mrs. Blackwood's expression. A brief, unguarded emotion that Miss Marple couldn't quite identify. That belonged to my sister, Margaret, Mrs. Blackwood said after a moment. Eliza's mother. It was returned to us after her death. Returned? How curious. It had been borrowed. Mrs. Blackwood's tone suggested the subject was closed. Now, about the fate. Their conversation was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Charles Pemberton, who appeared agitated. Mrs. Blackwood, forgive the intrusion, but I must speak with you urgently. Colonel Blackwood has just been taken in for questioning by Inspector Craddock. Mrs. Blackwood paled visibly. Questioning? Whatever for? The trust finances, I'm afraid. Discrepancies that apparently implicate the Colonel rather directly. That's absurd. Arthur would never. She stopped, seeming to remember Miss Marple's presence. You must excuse me, Miss Marple. A misunderstanding that requires my immediate attention. After Mrs. Blackwood hastily departed with Pemberton, Miss Marple remained seated, her thoughtful gaze moving around the drawing-room. Her attention settled on a silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece. A younger colonel and Mrs. Blackwood, with a beautiful dark-haired woman who bore a striking resemblance to Eliza. Margaret Blackwood, presumably. As Miss Marple was preparing to leave, Eliza entered the drawing-room, looking surprised to find her there. Miss Marple, I wasn't aware you were visiting. Your aunt and I were discussing the church fete, but she was called away on urgent business. Something about your uncle being questioned by Inspector Craddock. Eliza's expression darkened. They think Uncle Arthur embezzled from the trust, but it's ridiculous. He would never risk the family's reputation. Family reputation means a great deal to the Blackwoods, I imagine, Miss Marple said mildly. I was just admiring this photograph of your mother. She was very beautiful. Eliza approached the mantelpiece, her fingers touching the frame gently. She was. She died when I was quite young. An accident. How tragic. And yet, some part of her lives on in you. Not just her appearance, but perhaps her taste as well. That lovely rose brooch you wore yesterday, for instance. Eliza's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where the brooch had been pinned during the inquest. It was hers. Aunt Dolores gave it to me recently, for my birthday. How thoughtful, though I could have sworn I saw it in a photograph on Philip Harrington's desk some months ago. The young woman's eyes widened slightly before she composed herself. That's impossible. It's been in my aunt's jewellery box for years. Perhaps I'm mistaken, Miss Marple conceded. My eyesight isn't what it was. By the way, I understand you were quite supportive of your ideas for the trust. He was the only one, Eliza said, a note of bitterness creeping into her voice. Uncle Arthur thought my educational initiative was sentimental nonsense, but Philip saw its value. How fortunate to have such an ally, Miss Marple observed. I imagine his death has been a significant setback for your plans." "It's more than that," Eliza replied, suddenly earnest. "Philip wasn't just an ally. He was—" She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she'd said too much. "Yes, my dear." But Eliza had retreated behind a careful smile. "He was a good friend to our family. Now, if you'll excuse me, I should check on Aunt Dolores. She'll be terribly upset about Uncle Arthur." As Miss Marple made her way home, she mulled over this newest piece of information. The rose brooch created a connection between Philip Harrington and Eliza Blackwood that went beyond professional courtesy. A connection significant enough that he kept a photograph of the brooch, or perhaps of someone wearing it, on his desk. And then there was the contradiction between Diana and Vivian's accounts of the reconciliation, and the matter of the missing trust documents that apparently implicated Colonel Blackwood in financial impropriety. Layer upon layer, secret upon secret, the case was beginning to resemble one of her more complicated knitting patterns, with every stitch connected to the whole. She had a growing sense of the truth, but several crucial threads were still missing from the design. Chapter 7. Echoes from London. The morning paper brought startling news to the residents of St. Mary Mead. Colonel Blackwood had been released without charge, but Diana Harrington had been formally arrested for the murder of her brother. The village post office hummed with discussion as Miss Marple collected her weekly pension. "Well, there you have it," declared Mrs. Beavis, the postmistress. "I said from the beginning it was the sister. Blood will tell, as my mother used to say." "Indeed?" Miss Marple replied mildly. "And what evidence have the police discovered, I wonder?" "Something about poison, from what I hear," offered Mr. Tompkins, the butcher. "That London detective, Inspector, what's his name from Scotland Yard, arrived yesterday. Says they've found digitalis in her London flat." "Inspector Sullivan," Mrs. Beavis corrected. "And not just digitalis. A whole book on poisonous plants, with the foxglove page marked. As clear as day, if you ask me." Miss Marple left the post office deep in thought. The arrival of Scotland Yard suggested the case had taken on new dimensions, and the supposed evidence against Diana seemed almost too perfect, too neat. She was so absorbed in her reflections that she nearly collided with Dr. Gerard outside the chemist's shop. "Forgive me, Doctor, I was wool-gathering, I'm afraid." "No harm done," he assured her. "I imagine you've heard the news about Diana Harrington?" "Yes, though I confess I find it rather peculiar. A book on poisonous plants with a marked page seems convenient." Dr. Gerard nodded thoughtfully. "I had the same thought. Especially as many educated people have such books. I own several myself." "As do I," Miss Marple agreed. "Essential for any serious gardener. Have you met this Inspector Sullivan from Scotland Yard?" "Briefly. He seems competent enough, though perhaps overeager to resolve the case. He's particularly interested in the trust documents, believes Diana stole them to conceal her brother's investigation into her financial affairs." "Her financial affairs? I wasn't aware Philip was investigating Diana." According to Vivian Harrington, Philip had concerns about Diana's management of her trust fund. Apparently she'd been living beyond her means. "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured, "though it contradicts what Charles Pemberton told me, that Philip was investigating discrepancies in the trust accounts that implicated Colonel Blackwood." Seems everyone has a different version of what Philip was investigating, Dr. Gerard observed wryly, which suggests to me that someone is deliberately muddying the waters. As they parted ways, Miss Marple decided to pay a call on Vivian Harrington. The widowed Mrs. Harrington had moved from Thornfield Hall to the village's small but elegant hotel, the Blue Boar, where she was staying while arrangements for her husband's funeral were finalized. Miss Marple found her in the hotel's private sitting room, reviewing papers with the focused attention of a woman accustomed to business matters. "Miss Marple," Vivian greeted her with mild surprise, "I wasn't expecting visitors." "Forgive the intrusion, my dear. I simply wanted to offer my condolences again, especially in light of recent developments." Vivian's expression hardened slightly. "You mean Diana's arrest? I can't say I'm surprised. The evidence was always pointing in her direction." "Yes, quite compelling evidence," Miss Marple agreed, settling into a chair, "though sometimes the most obvious solution is crafted to distract from the truth, like a magician's sleight of hand." Vivian set down her papers with deliberate care. "What exactly are you implying, Miss Marple?" "Nothing at all, my dear, simply an old woman's philosophical musings. I understand you've been most helpful to Inspector Craddock, providing copies of your husband's documents." "It was the right thing to do," Vivian replied. "Philip would have wanted the truth to come out about the trust discrepancies, among other things." Vivian hesitated, then continued. "Philip had become increasingly concerned about Diana's financial situation. Her trust fund was nearly depleted, yet her lifestyle hadn't changed. He suspected she might be involved in something irregular." "I see. And yet Mr. Pemberton seems to believe Philip was investigating Colonel Blackwood's management of the Air Trust." A flash of irritation crossed Vivian's face. "Charles Pemberton is hardly an objective source. He's been angling for a position on the trust board for years, and now, with both the Colonel under suspicion and Philip gone, such a position might finally be within his reach," Miss Marple observed. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Sullivan, a brisk, efficient-looking man, with sharp eyes and a sceptical mouth. "Mrs. Harrington, I beg your pardon. I didn't realize you had company. This is Miss Marple, Inspector, a local resident." "Ah, the village spinster turned amateur detective. Inspector Craddock mentioned you." His tone was dismissive. "I'm afraid I must ask you to excuse us, Miss Marple. Mrs. Harrington and I have official business to discuss." "Of course." Miss Marple rose, gathering her belongings. "I was just leaving. Though I wonder, Inspector, if you've had the opportunity to examine the rose brooch Eliza Blackwood wore to the inquest." Sullivan looked, startled. "The brooch? Why would that be of interest?" "Perhaps it isn't," Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "Just an old woman's curiosity about pretty things. Good day to you both." As she left the Blue Boar, Miss Marple noticed a sleek automobile pulling up, bearing London licence plates. From it emerged a striking young woman in fashionable attire, her determined stride suggesting purpose rather than casual visit. There was something vaguely familiar about her features, though Miss Marple was certain they had never met. Her curiosity piqued, Miss Marple lingered by a shop window, watching as the young woman entered the hotel. Within minutes, raised voices could be heard from the sitting-room window, Vivian's controlled tones contrasting with the visitor's more passionate ones. "You had no right, Vivian. None whatsoever. Keep your voice down, Rachel. This is hardly the place. I don't care who hears. First Philip, now Diana. When does it end? The window closed abruptly, cutting off the rest of the exchange. Miss Marple stood thoughtfully for a moment before making her way to the vicarage, where she found Mrs. Entwistle arranging flowers in the church porch. Agnes, do you recall if Philip Harrington had any other family besides Diana and Vivian? Mrs. Entwistle considered the question. I don't believe so, though there was some talk when he first came to the village, a scandal of some sort from his London days. A young woman, I think, though the details escape me. A young woman, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. How interesting! I wonder if Eliza might know more. She and Philip seemed quite well acquainted. Mrs. Entwistle's eyes widened. Eliza and Philip? Surely not. The Blackwoods would never allow such a connection. Besides, he was nearly twice her age. Age differences matter less than one might think, Miss Marple observed, particularly when strong feelings are involved. That evening, as darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple was startled by an urgent knocking at her cottage door. Opening it, she found a breathless Eliza Blackwood on her doorstep. Miss Marple, you must help. The young woman's face was pale with distress. There's been another death. Suicide, they're saying, but I don't believe it. Calm yourself, my dear. Who has died? Charles Pemberton. They found him in his office an hour ago. Poison, just like Philip was poisoned. Eliza's voice broke. And now they're saying he left a confession, admitting he killed Philip over the trust accounts. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. A confession, you say? How very convenient. You don't believe it either, do you? Let's just say I find the timing significant. Tell me, Eliza, who discovered Mr. Pemberton's body? Inspector Sullivan. He went to question Charles about Diana's case and found him slumped over his desk, a glass of poisoned whiskey beside him. I see, Miss Marple said softly. And this confession, what exactly did it say? That Charles had been embezzling from the trust for years, and Philip discovered it. That he poisoned Philip with digitalis at the garden party, and then struck him with the paperweight when it didn't work quickly enough. A comprehensive confession indeed, Miss Marple observed, almost as if someone wanted to ensure all the loose ends were neatly tied. Eliza looked at her with desperate hope. Then you'll help? You'll find out what really happened to Philip and Charles? My dear, Miss Marple said gently, I believe I already know what happened, but proving it, that will require a bit more than an old woman's intuition. Now tell me everything you know about a young woman named Rachel who arrived from London today. Chapter 8. A Game of Teacups. The funeral of Charles Pemberton was a subdued affair, attended primarily by professional acquaintances rather than friends. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the churchyard, observing the mourners with quiet attention. Inspector Sullivan was present, his expression revealing nothing as the vicar spoke of a troubled soul finding peace. Colonel and Mrs. Blackwood maintained a dignified silence, though Miss Marple noted the tension in Dolores Blackwood's shoulders. Eliza stood slightly apart from her relatives, her face pale but composed. Most interesting to Miss Marple, however, was the presence of the young woman from London, Rachel, who stood at the back of the gathering, her expression a complex mixture of grief and anger. She departed immediately after the service, avoiding conversation with the other mourners. Curious attendants for a supposed murderer and suicide, observed Dr. Gerard, who had materialized at Miss Marple's side. Indeed, she agreed. One might almost think they were paying respects rather than closing a chapter. Sullivan seems satisfied at any rate. I understand he's recommending Diana Harrington's release. The case against her collapsed once Pemberton's confession was authenticated. Authenticated? Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. By handwriting, I presume? Yes, though I gather there were some discrepancies. Still, Sullivan is eager to return to London. A neat solution suits his purposes. Neat, but incorrect, Miss Marple said softly. Charles Pemberton did not kill Philip Harrington. Dr. Gerard looked at her with interest. You seem very certain. I am, and I believe I can prove it with a little assistance. Tell me, Doctor, would you be willing to help arrange a small gathering this evening? Nothing elaborate, just tea at my cottage with a few carefully selected guests. A tea party, Miss Marple, at a time like this? Oh, I find tea parties most illuminating, she replied with a gentle smile. People reveal so much over a good cup of Darjeeling. That afternoon, Miss Marple was unusually busy. She visited the village shop for tea and cakes, the florist for a specific arrangement, and made several telephone calls. By 5 o'clock, her cottage was prepared for visitors. The best china laid out, flowers arranged just so, and a certain photograph placed prominently on the mantelpiece. Dr. Gerard arrived first, followed shortly by Eliza Blackwood, who seemed puzzled by the invitation but eager for any development in the case. Inspector Craddock came next, having been persuaded to remain in St. Mary Mead despite Sullivan's assumption of authority. The last arrival was the most surprising, Rachel from London, who entered with obvious reluctance. I don't understand why I'm here, she said, glancing around the cottage with wary eyes. You said you had information about Philip's death. Indeed I do, my dear, Miss Marple replied, serving tea with practised grace. But first, introductions are in order. This is Rachel Harrington, Philip's daughter from his first marriage, a marriage that ended rather abruptly some 20 years ago. Eliza gasped, nearly dropping her teacup. Daughter! But Philip never mentioned— No, he wouldn't have, Rachel interrupted bitterly. He abandoned my mother when I was an infant. We never heard from him again until last month, when he suddenly reached out, wanting to make amends. How extraordinary, Miss Marple commented, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. And yet, he kept your photograph on his desk. What photograph? Rachel demanded. In answer, Miss Marple gestured to the mantelpiece, where a silver-framed photograph stood, not of Rachel, as her words had implied, but of Margaret Blackwood wearing the ruby rose brooch. That's not me, Rachel said, frowning. I've never seen that woman before. No, that is Margaret Blackwood, Eliza's mother, Miss Marple agreed, watching Eliza's face carefully. But the brooch she's wearing is remarkably similar to one that appears in a photograph Philip did keep. A photograph of your mother, I believe. Rachel's expression shifted from confusion to shock. How did you know about that brooch? It was my grandmother's. My mother always wore it. She said Philip took it when he left. Took it or reclaimed it? Miss Marple asked gently. Family heirlooms often have complicated histories. the Harrington Rose brooch, passed down through generations until it somehow ended up with Margaret Blackwood. Eliza had grown very still, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Nothing yet, my dear. I'm merely arranging the pieces of the puzzle." She turned to Inspector Craddock. "Perhaps you could share what you discovered about Margaret Blackwood's death, the accident that occurred 20 years ago." Craddock cleared his throat uncomfortably. "As you requested, I looked into the records. Margaret Blackwood died from a fall down the main staircase at Thornfield Hall. The coroner ruled it accidental, though there was some discussion of possible domestic tensions. The Colonel had a temper in those days, Miss Marple supplied, and Margaret was planning to leave him, perhaps to reunite with a former love, a love who had recently given her a valuable family heirloom as a token of his affection." The silence that followed was electric. "You're saying Philip and my mother," Eliza whispered, her face draining of colour, "were deeply in love, yes, before. He married his first wife, Rachel's mother," Miss Marple confirmed. "But Margaret married Colonel Blackwood instead, a more advantageous match, socially speaking." "And you believe my uncle was responsible for my mother's death?" Eliza's voice trembled. "The evidence suggests it was no accident," Craddock admitted, reluctantly. "But after 20 years, it would be nearly impossible to prove. Unless," Miss Marple added quietly, "someone else had already pieced together the truth. Someone who had access to old letters, perhaps, or family documents. Someone who then used that knowledge as leverage." Rachel set down her teacup with a sharp click. "Philip told me he'd discovered something about Margaret's death, something that implicated someone powerful. That's why he wanted to meet after all these years. He said he needed to make things right for both of us." "Both of us," Eliza repeated. Rachel met her gaze directly. "He said he had a daughter in St. Mary Mead who didn't know he was her father, that her mother had died before she could tell her the truth. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable." Eliza's hand moved to her throat, where the rose brooch had been pinned during the inquest. "The brooch," she murmured. "Aunt Dolores only gave it to me after Philip became director of the trust. She said it had been my mother's, but it was actually a Harrington family heirloom," Miss Marple finished for her. "Given to your mother by Philip as a token of their love. And I suspect that when Philip saw you wearing it at a trust meeting, he recognized it immediately. The distinctive ruby petals are quite unique. And that's why he supported my education initiative," Eliza realized. "Not because of the proposal itself, but because of me." "Indeed, he was trying to make amends in his own way," Miss Marple agreed. "But when he began investigating the trust's finances, he discovered something else. Evidence that implicated Colonel Blackwood not just in financial impropriety, but potentially in Margaret's death as well. And then Charles discovered the same evidence," Dr. Gerard concluded, "which is why both of them had to die." Inspector Craddock leaned forward intently. "Are you suggesting Colonel Blackwood is responsible for both murders?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple replied, reaching for the teapot. "The Colonel had motive, certainly, but the murders required a more calculating mind. Someone who understood poisons, who could plan meticulously, and who stood to gain considerably from Philip's death." As she refilled the teacups, Miss Marple's gaze moved deliberately to the window, where a figure could be seen approaching the cottage gate. Vivian Harrington, elegant even in mourning, hesitated before opening the gate and walking up the garden path. "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "our final guest has arrived, right on time." Chapter 9. The Web Unravels. Vivian Harrington paused in the doorway of Miss Marple's cottage, her dark eyes taking in the assembled company with a single comprehensive glance. If she was surprised to find Rachel among the guests, she betrayed no sign of it, her composure as impeccable as her tailored black suit. "What an unexpected gathering," she remarked, her voice cool and controlled. "I received your note, Miss Marple, though I confess I didn't anticipate such diverse company." "Do come in, Mrs. Harrington," Miss Marple replied, rising to pour another cup of tea. "We were just discussing family histories. Such fascinating subjects, don't you think? The way the past shapes our present." Vivian accepted the offered chair, though she made no move to touch the teacup placed before her. "I'm afraid I have little time for nostalgia. The past is best left where it belongs." "An understandable sentiment," Miss Marple nodded, "particularly when the past contains uncomfortable truths." Rachel was just sharing how Philip reached out to her last month. Quite a change of heart after 20 years of silence. Vivian's gaze shifted to Rachel, assessing. Philip had many regrets toward the end. He became increasingly sentimental. "Sentimental enough to investigate Margaret Blackwood's death?" Miss Marple asked, her gentle tone belying the sharpness of the question. A barely perceptible tensing of Vivian's shoulders was the only indication that the question had struck home. "I wasn't aware that he was. Margaret's death was tragic, but hardly mysterious. An accident that occurred long before Philip and I were married. And yet," Miss Marple continued, "he kept a photograph of Rachel's mother wearing the Harrington rose brooch, the same brooch that later appeared on Margaret Blackwood and now on Eliza. That seems rather more than coincidence." "Jewellery changes hands," Vivian replied dismissively, "particularly family pieces." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed. "But this particular piece holds special significance, doesn't it? The Harrington rose brooch, crafted for your husband's great-grandmother, passed down through generations of Harrington women. A symbol of legitimacy, one might say." Inspector Craddock leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Legitimacy?" "In a manner of speaking," Miss Marple clarified. "The brooch traditionally passed from mother to daughter, or in Philip's case, from father to daughter's mother. When he gave it to Margaret, it was a declaration of sorts." "This is absurd," Vivian interjected. "You're creating drama from an ordinary piece of jewellery." "Am I?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Then perhaps we should discuss the trust documents instead, the ones that went missing after Philip's murder, the ones that contained not just evidence of financial impropriety, but proof of a far more serious crime. Those documents proved nothing except Charles Pemberton's guilt," Vivian stated firmly. "His suicide confirmed it. On the contrary," Miss Marple countered, "they proved that Colonel Blackwood had been systematically embezzling from the trust for years with the assistance of someone proficient in financial matters, someone who helped conceal the discrepancies until Philip, with his meticulous attention to detail, finally detected them." Vivian's expression hardened. "If you're implying I was involved in any impropriety..." Oh, I'm implying far more than that, Mrs. Harrington, Miss Marple said, her blue eyes suddenly sharp as steel. I believe you were the architect of a most elaborate deception, one that began years ago when you first learned of Philip's relationship with Margaret Blackwood. Rachel gasped softly, while Eliza sat perfectly still, her eyes moving between Miss Marple and Vivian. You discovered the old letters, didn't you? Miss Marple continued. Perhaps while organising Philip's papers, you found correspondence between him and Margaret, evidence of their love affair, and possibly of Eliza's true parentage. This is pure speculation, Vivian snapped, though a flush had risen to her cheeks. Is it? Then let me speculate further. You realized that this information gave you leverage over Colonel Blackwood. You approached him with what you knew, that his wife had been unfaithful, that Eliza might not be his niece by blood, and offered a partnership. He would provide access to the Trust's funds, and you would ensure his family secret remained buried. Inspector Craddock's expression had grown increasingly grave. Miss Marple, these are serious allegations. Indeed they are, Inspector, but they explain why Philip suddenly became so interested in both the Trust's finances and Margaret's death. He had begun to suspect not only financial misconduct, but a darker truth, that Margaret's fatal fall was no accident. And you believe the Colonel killed his wife? Dr. Gerard asked. I believe he had motive, Miss Marple replied carefully. But whether he acted alone? Her gaze returned to Vivian, whose composure was now visibly strained. This is outrageous, Vivian declared, rising to her feet. I won't sit here and listen to unfounded accusations. Then perhaps you'd prefer to explain why digitalis was found in your gardening gloves? Miss Marple asked quietly. The same gloves you wore to the garden party, when you greeted your husband with a kiss on the cheek, transferring just enough of the poison to begin its work. Vivian froze. My gloves? How did you... Inspector Craddock was kind enough to examine the items you left at Thornfield Hall, Miss Marple explained, including your gardening equipment. You're quite the botanist, I understand, particularly knowledgeable about medicinal plants. Many women garden, Vivian countered, though her voice had lost its earlier confidence. Of course, but few have the expertise to extract and administer digitalis with such precision. Enough to disorient, but not immediately kill. You needed Philip confused when he went to the study, vulnerable to the second part of your plan. And what plan was that exactly? Vivian demanded, an edge of desperation creeping into her tone. To eliminate Philip before he could expose both the financial scheme and the truth about Margaret's death, Miss Marple stated simply. You followed him to the study, struck him from behind with the paperweight, and took the trust documents. Then you arranged the scene to implicate Diana, knowing her arrival that day would cast suspicion on her. You can't prove any of this, Vivian said, though her eyes darted briefly to the door. Perhaps not every detail, Miss Marple conceded, but there is one piece of evidence you overlooked. The telephone call Philip supposedly made before his death. There was no record of it on the exchange. He never made a call. It was merely his excuse to go to the study, where he planned to confront you about what he had discovered. Rachel suddenly spoke up, her voice tight with emotion. He told me he was meeting someone at the garden party, someone he couldn't trust but had to confront. He said if anything happened to him, I should look in the London flat, behind the painting in his study. Inspector Craddock started. Behind the painting, We searched the flat thoroughly. Not behind the Van Gogh reproduction, Rachel clarified. The small watercolour of St. Mary Mead Church. It has a false backing. I found it last night. From her handbag, she withdrew a sealed envelope and handed it to Craddock, who opened it carefully. Inside were several yellowed letters and a handwritten statement signed by Philip Harrington. "It's all here," Craddock said after scanning the contents. The financial records showing systematic embezzlement, Philip's suspicions about Margaret Blackwood's death, and his belief that Vivian had been blackmailing the Colonel using evidence of the affair. Vivian's composure finally cracked. Philip was going to ruin everything. 20 years I spent building our position, securing our future, and he was ready to throw it all away for a sentimental reconciliation with his illegitimate daughter and his former lover's child. "So you killed him," Eliza said softly, her face pale but resolute. "And then Charles, when he discovered the truth." "Charles was a fool," Vivian spat. "He thought he could use the information to secure a position on the trust board. As if I would allow such a weak man to threaten what I had built." Inspector Craddock rose, his expression grim. "Vivian Harrington, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murders of Philip Harrington and Charles Pemberton. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be given in evidence." As Craddock led her suddenly, deflated Vivian from the cottage, Miss Marple poured fresh tea for her remaining guests. "There is one question I still don't understand," Dr. Gerard said after a moment of silence. "Why did Vivian come here today? Surely she must have suspected a trap." "Curiosity," Miss Marple replied simply, "and perhaps a certain confidence in her own cleverness. The truly dangerous criminals often believe themselves immune to detection, particularly by someone they perceive as harmless, like an elderly village spinster," Rachel suggested with the ghost of a smile. "Precisely, my dear. People rarely see what they don't expect to find." Miss Marple turned to Eliza, who had remained silent, her fingers tracing the outline of the rose brooch she wore. "Are you all right, my dear?" Eliza looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't know what to think. About my mother, about the Colonel, about who I really am. You are exactly who you have always been," Miss Marple told her gently. "A young woman of intelligence and compassion. The rest, well, that's for you to decide what importance it holds." "And you," Eliza turned to Rachel, "if what they're saying is true, then we're sisters in a way," Rachel completed, her expression softening. "Half-sisters at least. I'd like to know you better, if you're willing." As the two young women regarded each other with cautious hope, Miss Marple smiled to herself. Even the darkest mysteries, she reflected, sometimes led to unexpected light. Chapter 10. The Silence Broken. A fortnight after Vivian Harrington's arrest, the village of St. Mary Mead had begun to settle back into its customary rhythms. The sensation of murder had gradually given way to the more prosaic concerns of daily life, the weather, the vicar's Sunday sermon, Mrs. Pierce's new variety of currant buns. Yet beneath this return to normalcy, subtle changes had taken place, shifts in relationships and understandings that would linger long after the headlines faded. Miss Marple was tending to her autumn garden when the gate clicked open to admit Inspector Craddock, looking more relaxed than she had seen him since the investigation began. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he greeted her. "I thought you might like to know that Vivian Harrington has confessed to both murders." "Has she indeed?" Miss Marple straightened, brushing soil from her gardening gloves. "I suppose the evidence was rather overwhelming in the end." "Quite." Craddock accepted the offer of tea with a nod as they moved inside the cottage. She maintained her composure until we presented the analysis of the digitalis found on her gloves. The concentration matched exactly what was found in Philip's system. And Charles Pemberton? Did she explain how she managed that particular deception? She visited him the evening of his death, ostensibly to discuss Philip's affairs. She had already prepared the confession and brought digitalis-laced whiskey as a peace offering. Poor Pemberton never suspected a thing. Few people expect betrayal from those they perceive as allies, Miss Marple observed, pouring the tea. "And the Colonel? What has become of him?" Craddock's expression turned grim. "He's under investigation for financial crimes relating to the Trust, but the matter of Margaret Blackwood's death is more complicated. Vivian claims she has evidence that he was responsible, but one can hardly trust the word of a convicted murderess," Miss Marple finished for him, "particularly one as calculating as Vivian Harrington." "Precisely. Though there's little doubt that Margaret's death was no accident. We've reopened the case based on witness statements from the time that were overlooked in the original investigation." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "The Colonel had powerful friends in those days, I imagine, and a grieving widower with a young niece to raise might easily elicit sympathy from the authorities. The wheels of justice turn slowly sometimes, but they do turn," Craddock replied. "Which reminds me, Inspector Sullivan sends his regards, along with his apologies for dismissing your insights. He's recommended you receive an official commendation for your assistance." Miss Marple blushed slightly. "Oh dear, that's hardly necessary. Anyone who observed the facts carefully would have reached the same conclusions." "I rather doubt that," Craddock smiled. "Your understanding of human nature is quite exceptional, Miss Marple." After the inspector departed, Miss Marple decided to take her afternoon constitutional along Sycamore Street. The road, once lined with grand elms before Dutch elm disease claimed them decades ago, was now flanked by the sycamores that gave it its name. She paused before the gates of Thornfield Hall, noting the for sale sign newly erected at the entrance. The Blackwoods would be leaving St. Mary Mead, she had heard. The Colonel, released on bail pending his financial trial, had decided to move to their smaller property in Scotland, far from the whispers and sidelong glances that now followed him through the village. As Miss Marple continued her walk, she encountered Dr. Gerard emerging from a cottage where he had been attending to one of his elderly patients. "Miss Marple, just the person I hoped to see," he greeted her warmly. "I've had the most interesting letter from Rachel Harrington." "Have you indeed? How is she settling back in London?" "Quite well, it seems. She's initiated proceedings to claim her rightful share of her father's estate. With Vivian's conviction, there's little standing in her way. But more interestingly, she's invited Eliza to stay with her for a time." "How wonderful!" Miss Marple smiled. "I had hoped they might form a connection. They both suffered similar losses, after all." Indeed. Dr. Gerard fell into step beside her as they continued down Sycamore Street. Eliza has accepted, I understand. She seems determined to forge her own path now, independent of the Blackwoods. A wise decision, I think. She has her mother's spirit, whether by blood or by upbringing. Speaking of which, Dr. Gerard lowered his voice slightly, though there was no one nearby to overhear. The DNA tests have confirmed it. Philip Harrington was indeed Eliza's biological father. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. I suspected as much. The resemblance is subtle but unmistakable, once one knows to look for it. Something in the set of the eyes, the particular way she tilts her head when thinking. You noticed that from the beginning? Not immediately, she admitted. But when I saw her wearing the rose brooch, it sparked a memory. Philip had shown me a photograph once, during a charity committee meeting, his first wife wearing that very brooch. He seemed melancholy afterward, though I didn't understand why at the AHCUR time. They paused at the intersection where Sycamore Street met the High Street, the heart of the village spreading before them with its familiar shops and cottages. It's remarkable, Dr. Gerard observed, how a place so peaceful can harbour such dark secrets. People are the same everywhere, Doctor, Miss Marple replied. The trappings may differ, but the fundamental passions, love, hate, greed, jealousy, remain constant whether in London or St. Mary Mead. And yet you seem to see what others miss. She smiled gently. Perhaps because I expect to find it. When one has lived as long as I have, observing human nature in all its varieties, one learns that the capacity for both good and evil exists in the most unexpected places. As they parted ways, Miss Marple continued her walk, eventually finding herself at the churchyard. She made her way to a grave she had visited occasionally over the years, Margaret Blackwood's final resting place, marked by a simple headstone with a carved rose at its centre. She'll know the truth now, came a voice from behind her. Miss Marple turned to find Eliza standing there, a small bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. Yes, my dear, I believe she will, Miss Marple agreed softly. Eliza placed the flowers at the base of the headstone. I used to come here as a child, imagining what she was like. Aunt Dolores rarely spoke of her, and Uncle Arthur. Well, now I understand why. Your mother was much loved by those who truly knew her, Miss Marple said. The vicar's wife still speaks of her kindness to this day, and by Philip, my father, Eliza added, testing the word carefully. It's strange to say that aloud. These years, and I never knew. Would it have changed who you are? Miss Marple asked gently. Eliza considered this. Perhaps not. But it might have changed how I understood myself. I always felt different from the Blackwoods. Now I know why. Different, yet still your mother's daughter, Miss Marple reminded her. And now you have a sister of sorts, in Rachel. Yes. Eliza smiled for the first time. We're going to London next week. Rachel thinks I should apply to university there, perhaps study education, to develop my ideas about the trust. The trust will continue then? With new leadership and oversight, yes. Rachel and I both feel it's important to honour what was good about Philip's work, whatever his personal failings. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, they walked together back toward the village square, where the everyday life of St. Mary Mead continued. Shopkeepers closing for the day, children returning from school, the postman making his final rounds. Will you miss it? Miss Marple asked. St. Mary Mead, I mean. Yes, Eliza admitted, but I'll return. This is still home, despite everything that's happened. They paused before Miss Marple's cottage, its garden neat and welcoming in the autumn light. I wanted to thank you, Eliza said earnestly, for uncovering the truth, however painful it might be. Truth has a way of emerging eventually, my dear, Miss Marple replied, like flowers pushing through the soil in spring. We can bury them for a time, but their nature is to grow toward the light. As Eliza continued on her way, Miss Marple stood for a moment at her garden gate, watching the familiar scene of village life unfold before her. Sycamore Street was no longer silent, its secrets brought into the open at last. And though the revelations had brought pain, they had also created the possibility of healing and new beginnings. The mystery had been solved, the culprit brought to justice. Yet, for Miss Marple, the true resolution lay not in the legal outcome, but in the human one, in Eliza's cautious hope, in Rachel's newfound family, in the village's gradual return to the rhythms that sustained it through joy and tragedy alike. Stated, a small nod of satisfaction. She turned and entered her cottage as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Chapter 11. Letters from London. 6 months had passed since the events that had shaken St. Mary Mead to its foundations. Winter had given way to spring, and Miss Marple's garden was once again bursting with colour. Daffodils nodding in the gentle breeze, tulips standing at attention like bright sentinels, and the first buds appearing on her prized roses. She was carefully pruning a climbing clematis when the postman arrived with a thicker bundle of letters than usual. Thanking him, she carried the mail inside and settled in her favourite armchair by the window to sort through it. Among the usual correspondence and parish newsletters was a cream-coloured envelope bearing a London postmark. Inside was a folded letter and a photograph showing Eliza and Rachel Harrington standing together outside the British Museum, their resemblance to each other more pronounced now that they were side by side, though Rachel had their father's darker colouring, while Eliza had inherited Margaret's fair hair. My dear Miss Marple, the letter began in Eliza's neat handwriting. I hope this finds you well and enjoying the spring weather. London continues to be everything I hoped for and more. Rachel has been the most wonderful guide and, dare I say, sister one could wish for. We've established a routine of visiting a different museum or gallery each Sunday, followed by tea and long conversations about everything under the sun. Miss Marple smiled, pleased by this development. She continued reading as Eliza described, her studies at university, where she had indeed pursued education with a focus on programs for underprivileged children. The trust reformation is proceeding well, the letter continued. With Diana's assistance, yes, we have reconciled completely. We've restructured the board and implemented strict oversight measures. The new educational initiative will launch next month, providing scholarships for promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Philip would have approved, I think, whatever his faults. There was news of Colonel Blackwood as well. He had pleaded guilty to the financial charges, receiving a suspended sentence due to his age and health, but the investigation into Margaret's death had stalled due to insufficient evidence. He remained in Scotland, a shadow of his former self, according to reports from the few who had seen him. Dolores writes occasionally, Eliza noted. She seems relieved in her way that the truth has emerged at last. She admitted she had suspected Philip was my father for years, but could never bring herself to confront the Colonel about it. Their marriage was one of convenience rather than love, I think, especially after my mother died. As Miss Marple set the letter aside to finish her tea, there was a gentle knock at her door. Opening it, she found Dr. Gerard standing on her doorstep, a newspaper tucked under his arm. "I thought you might be interested in this," he said, following her inside and unfolding the paper to reveal a small article on an inner page. "Vivian Harrington's trial has concluded." "And the verdict?" Miss Marple asked, though she had little doubt. "Guilty on all counts. Life imprisonment, with a recommendation that she serve a minimum of 25 years. He accepted the offer of tea with thanks. The judge was particularly severe in his summation, called it one of the most calculated and cold-blooded cases he'd encountered. "Not without reason," Miss Marple observed. "Vivian had been planning her schemes for years. I suspect the financial impropriety with the trust was merely the beginning. You never did explain how you first came to suspect her," Dr. Gerard said. "Was it the digitalis?" Miss Marple shook her head. "It was something much simpler. When I visited Diana at Sycamore Cottage, she seemed genuinely surprised to learn that the trust documents were missing. If she had murdered her brother and stolen those papers, as the police initially suspected, she would hardly have reacted that way. And yet she had motive. The estrangement, the inheritance dispute. Surface motives only, easily visible to anyone looking for a suspect. But Diana had already reconciled with Philip through their correspondence. She had nothing to gain from his death, and everything to lose." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "No, the true motive was far deeper. Vivian's determination to protect the position and wealth she had spent decades securing, including her complicity in covering up Margaret Blackwood's death." "I believe so. Vivian was already married to Philip when Margaret died, though they were living in London at the time. I suspect she discovered the letters between Philip and Margaret years ago and realized their value as leverage over the Colonel. One secret led to another, and another, until the web became too complex to sustain." Dr. Gerard shook his head in wonderment. "And all might have remained hidden if Philip hadn't developed a conscience in his later years. People do change, Doctor, often when confronted with their own mortality. Philip had received a concerning medical diagnosis, according to Rachel. It made him reevaluate his life and the wrongs he had committed or allowed to happen." Their conversation was interrupted by another visitor, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Entwistle, bearing a basket of freshly baked scones and eager to discuss the upcoming summer fete. "I've had the most wonderful letter from Eliza Blackwood," she announced as she settled herself at Miss Marple's table. "She's offered to fund new hymnals for the church in memory of her mother. Isn't that thoughtful?" "Most generous," Miss Marple agreed, rising to fetch another cup. "I received a letter from her myself just this morning. She seems to be thriving in London. Such a relief after all that dreadfulness." Mrs. Entwistle sighed. "Though I must say the village hasn't been the same since. Did you know the new owners of Thornfield Hall are planning to open it as some sort of retreat centre? Americans, I understand. Dr. Gerard, you must have heard something." As the conversation turned to village matters, Miss Marple listened with half an ear. her thoughts returning to Eliza's letter and the photograph of the two half-sisters. From tragedy had come an unexpected connection, a new family forged from the fragments of deception and loss. Later, after her visitors had departed, Miss Marple returned to her garden. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, not unlike that fateful day at Thornfield Hall, when Philip Harrington had met his end. She paused before her rose bushes, admiring the tight buds that would soon burst into glorious bloom. Her roses were not the apothecary's rose that had grown at Thornfield. She preferred the more delicate Souvenir de la Malmaison, with its subtle blush colour and intoxicating fragrance. But all roses, she reflected, shared the same essential nature: beauty coupled with thorns, the capacity to both enchant and wound, much like human beings, regardless of their social standing or the facades they presented to the world. Behind the most respectable exteriors could lurk the darkest intentions, while seemingly ordinary individuals might demonstrate extraordinary courage and resilience when tested. St. Mary Mead had weathered its storm of secrets and violence. Emerging, changed but unbroken, Sycamore Street was no longer silent, its hidden histories brought into the light of day. And though some wounds would take generations to heal completely, the truth had provided a foundation upon which healing could begin. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she carefully snipped a perfect bloom for her bedside table. The world would continue to surprise her, she had no doubt. New mysteries would emerge, new puzzles to untangle. But for now, in the gentle embrace of spring, she was content to tend her garden and observe the ever-fascinating panorama of human nature that surrounded her. The rose in her hand caught the last golden rays of afternoon sun, its petals glowing like rubies, a quiet reminder that beauty, like truth, would always find its way toward the light.